Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back. Joining us to discuss the U.S. military strikes on alleged drug boats is retired Major General Stephen Lepper, who is a former JAG Working Group member as well as a U.S. Air Force and former Deputy Judge Advocate General. Welcome to the show, Major General.
Good morning.
Can you talk a little bit about your background and in particular your legal work for the military?
Sure. Well, I come from a military family. I've been part of the military since I was born. My mother was actually liberated by the U.S. Army in Europe after World War II. My father served for 28 years as an enlisted NCO in the Air Force. I went to the Air Force Academy, graduated in 1979. The Air Force sent me to law school, and from that point onward, I served as a judge advocate. I served for 35 years total in uniform. And my daughter is currently serving in the Air Force. So we have a long history and respect for the U.S. military.
You're also a member of the Former JAGs Working Group. When and why was that group formed, and what have you been doing?
We were formed in February of this year when Secretary Hegseth fired the Judge Advocates General of the Army, Air Force, and Navy. And we gathered together, we former and retired judge advocates, because we were concerned about both the messaging that was delivered at that time, supporting the firing of the TJAGs, as well as the implications of those messages. The message, of course, was we don't want lawyers to stand as obstacles to what we want to do in military operations. We think lawyers actually detract from military operations instead of enhancing them. The larger implications of that message are essentially that we don't think the law or lawyers matter to military operations, and so we're not going to consider the law as we plan and execute future military operations. That's a dangerous message, and we as former judge advocates united in the common purpose to push back on that message.
Since the beginning of September, the U.S. military has carried out almost 24 strikes in the Caribbean on boats the Trump administration alleges have been trafficking drugs. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth yesterday was defending those strikes on those drug cartel boats during remarks that he made at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. Here he is yesterday.
And right now, the world is seeing the strength of American resolve in stemming the flow of lethal drugs to our country. Here, again, we've been focused, and here we've been clear. If you're working for a designated terrorist organization and you bring drugs to this country in a boat, we will find you and we will sink you. Let there be no doubt about it. President Trump can and will take decisive military action as he sees fit to defend our nation's interests. Let no country on earth doubt that for a moment. Like President Reagan, President Trump knows how to do so in a way that is tied to a clear purpose with a decisive and credible theory of military victory. Just as the lessons of Vietnam informed Ronald Reagan and his Weinberger Doctrine, so too the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan guide President Trump and his secretary today.
Major General Lepper, President Trump has told Congress that the U.S. is in non-international armed conflict with drug cartels and is treating these members as unlawful combatants. What does that mean, and what's your take on the Secretary's comments?
Well, my colleagues and I, are looking at this from a legal perspective. And as law of war experts, we understand that this operation targeting narco-trafficker boats does not qualify under international law as a non-international armed conflict. In order to have a non-international armed conflict, you need to have the element of armed on both sides. And in this particular case, we're not talking about an armed enemy. We're talking about a group of civilians who are trying to introduce drugs into our border. Now, there's no question that narco-trafficking is evil. Narco-trafficking is a crime. And the United States and other countries around the world have traditionally treated it as a crime. What we've done is we've basically taken that crime and we've put it into a new category that this administration argues is worthy of having lethal military force being applied against it. So my thoughts about the Secretary's comments are, first of all, this is not a non-international armed conflict, and secondly, by making it such, what we're basically doing is we're saying that we are justified in taking the lives of civilians without due process. Under the international law, it's called extrajudicial killing. And under our law, it's called murder. So what we're essentially being asked to do, our military, is murder civilians who are trying to bring drugs into our country, something that the Coast Guard is still handling as a law enforcement issue. And our argument is that we should continue treating it as such.
One of the more notable attacks has involved what's being referred to as a double tap, in which an order was given to kill survivors. Now, this week, Admiral Frank Bradley, who's a special operations commander overseeing the mission, told lawmakers on Capitol Hill that he issued the command to kill survivors, but that he was complying with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's verbal command to kill everyone on board, although the Secretary has denied that reporting about issuing to kill everyone order. What's been your reaction to this debate back and forth and the way that this played out?
Well, again, because this is not a non-international armed conflict, we argue that the laws of war do not apply to this situation. But let's put that aside. You know, that's a lot of lawyers talking about a lot of law. Let's consider for a moment that the laws of war do apply. Okay, the laws of war provide a minimum standard of treatment of persons involved in a conflict, minimum. And under these circumstances, where you have survivors of a strike on their vessel who are trying to climb back into their vessel, the vessel, of course, being non-navigable, and simply trying to survive, and who are dependent upon rescue in order to survive beyond climbing in the boat. That is the definition under the law of war of shipwrecked. And our obligation vis-a-vis shipwrecked sailors or shipwrecked personnel is not to target them, it's to protect them. So at the moment that we delivered that first strike and converted these individuals from targets to shipwrecked survivors, our obligation with regard to those people also changed, also shifted from one of attacker to one of rescuer. The fact that we did not uphold that obligation puts us in a position where we have violated international law, and the people up and down the chain of command who gave the order and executed the order essentially committed murder.
I want to play you some remarks from Secretary Hegseth earlier this year addressing generals, where he talks a bit about sort of these rules around engagement.
We fight to win. We unleash overwhelming and punishing violence on the enemy. We also don't fight with stupid rules of engagement. We untie the hands of our warfighters to intimidate, demoralize, hunt, and kill the enemies of our country. No more politically correct and overbearing rules of engagement. Just common sense, maximum lethality, and authority for warfighters. That's all I ever wanted as a platoon leader. And it's all my E6 squad leaders ever wanted, back to that E6 rule. We let our leaders fight their formations, and then we have their back. It's very simple, yet incredibly powerful. A few months ago, I was at the White House when President Trump announced his Liberation Day for America's trade policy. It was a landmark day. Well, today is another Liberation Day. The liberation of America's warriors, in name, in deed, and in authorities. You kill people and break things for a living. You are not politically correct and don't necessarily belong always in polite society. We are not an army of one. We are a joint force of millions of selfless Americans. We are warriors. We are purpose-built, not for fair weather, blue skies, or calm seas. We were built to load up in the back of helicopters, 5 tons, or Zodiacs in the dead of night, in fair weather or foul, to go to dangerous places, to find those who would do our nation harm, and deliver justice on behalf of the American people in close and brutal combat if necessary.
Major General, the Secretary said we don't fight with stupid rules of engagement. What is your assessment in terms of how this particular administration is approaching warfare more broadly, especially in this case?
Well, it struck me when I first heard that speech live that what he was describing could easily be applied to murderers and terrorists. The way that he was describing the use of force and the lethality that he believes that the military should operate with is certainly a description of what the military needs to be capable of doing. But the only thing that distinguishes us from murderers and terrorists is the idea that we do it consistent with the law. We are constrained by the law. And one of the fundamental principles of international law underpinning the laws of armed conflict is the concept of honor. We are an honorable profession. I served for 35 years in the Air Force, and my fellow airmen and the soldiers, sailors, and Marines I worked with during that 35 years all joined the military and served in the military because they believed it was an honorable profession, because they wanted to serve their country, because they wanted to defend us against enemies who would do us harm. We didn't consider ourselves murderers. We didn't consider ourselves terrorists because we were trained in the laws of war. The laws of war guided us. And so if you go back to that speech and you do a word search of the transcript and you look for the word honor anywhere in it, you won't find it. Secretary Hegseth's definition of warrior ethos does not include honor, does not include respect for law. That's the concern that united the former and retired JAGs in the purpose to push back on these messages. And I'm glad you played that clip for me.
You mentioned this, but several members of Congress, in talking about these strikes that have killed more than 80 people so far in the Caribbean, they're worried that some of these might be considered war crimes. What is the threshold for a war crime? And if these attacks are found to be unlawful, who ends up being responsible?
Well, again, assuming that the laws of war apply, which we argue they don't because this is an illegal operation from the very start, the laws of war are basically grounded in the Geneva Conventions, especially when it comes to the status of personnel that the military is ordered to fight. And the Geneva Conventions, in a non-international armed conflict, it would be the common Article 3 of all 4 Geneva Conventions, essentially defines people who should be protected. Now, going into an armed conflict, the proposition that one state is arrayed against another state assumes that it's the military of both states that are fighting. That's an international armed conflict. When you engage in a state versus non-state sponsored armed force, that's the definition of non-international armed conflict. And a war crime under either scenario would be a violation of the laws of war that apply to each of those conflicts. In this particular case, with regard to these particular boat strikes, the 2nd of September strike in particular, the targeting of survivors of a shipwreck specifically violates Common Article 3, which requires us to protect such persons, not continue to target them. A war crime is both a violation of the laws of war, but then the act itself could also be a violation of domestic U.S. law. And in this particular case, even if we assume that the administration is correct and this is a non-international armed conflict, a war crime may have been committed. At the same time, that act constituted murder under our domestic laws. So the people responsible for this would be everyone from the person who gave the order all the way down to the person who pulled the trigger. There's been a lot made over the past couple of weeks about the duty to disobey unlawful orders. In my view, the order to kill those survivors was an unlawful order. The person who gave it is responsible. The person who executed it is responsible. And everyone along that chain of command who facilitated it could be held criminally responsible as well.
We'll be taking questions for the Major General. Republicans can call at 202-748-8001, Democrats at 202-748-8000, and Independents at 202-748-8002. Before we get to callers, Senate Democrats and Senator Rand Paul have filed a war powers resolution to prevent the United States from engaging in military hostilities with Venezuela in particular without direction from Congress, without approval from Congress. How would that change the dynamic of what's happening if that were to pass?
Well, what that would do is it would impose the requirements of U.S. law on the decision to go to war in the first place. In this particular case with the boat strikes, the president made a unilateral decision to start targeting boats. And he has not complied with the war power resolution in the sense that he has allowed that operation to extend beyond 60 days without Congress's approval. If Congress takes the first step and exercises its authority under Article 1 of the Constitution to essentially make war, then what it would be saying is you can't do this unilaterally, Mr. President. We're telling you what the constraints are on you going forward with respect to this particular operation.
Let's hear questions and comments from Jeffrey in Alpena, Michigan, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Jeffrey.
Good morning, and thank you, General, for your service. I would just like to remind the folks that we have a felon that is running our country like a mob boss. And when he does something illegal, he has to destroy the evidence by killing the victims. Do you think that is what the orders were from the top, is to destroy all evidence with these two men clinging onto the boat?
Sir, I really can't speak to that. I don't know what was in the mind of the president when he started ordering these boat strikes. What I will say is that these boat strikes actually provide a lot of conflict for our troops, because at the same time we're conducting these boat strikes, killing the people on board, we're also still conducting law enforcement operations. The Coast Guard is still out there interdicting, seizing drugs and arresting drug runners. And at the same time, the Department of Justice has said in a memorandum that it issued several months ago that they're not going to prosecute these people who are manning these drug boats. And then lastly, the president has pardoned a major narco-trafficker. So when you put all these data points together, the cognitive dissonance that it creates for our military has got to be tremendous. A military member who's been asked to pull the trigger does so knowing that basically what he or she is doing doesn't matter to the overall effort to prevent drugs from coming to this country.
Let's hear now from Pat in Keyport, New Jersey, on our line for Republicans. Good morning, Pat.
Hello. I'd like you to address an issue I read about this week, which is that these the drug running boats, once you're in international waters, you're expected to fly the flag of the country that's your jurisdiction. And the story I've heard is that these are not carrying the flag of any country, and aren't they essentially pirate ships, which the U.S. military has a history of fighting through our existence as a country, and that it doesn't require a declaration of war. They're violating the rules of international navigation. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. No, that's not correct. Not flying a flag does not make you a target for lethal force. It could make you a target for boarding by law enforcement authorities from countries surrounding the body of water that they're on, but it certainly does not make that vessel subject to attack.
Rodney is in Manassas, Virginia, on our line for Independence. Good morning, Rodney.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for your service. But I do contradict what you're saying. The president actually classified the drug cartel as terrorists because of the hundreds of thousands of people that have died from fentanyl. And with them being in international water, they are open to subject, and, we have the right, or the president does, to give the military permission to destroy them before they enter our territory. In the process, everybody's talking this double tap. Well, it's actually a double hit. In the video that I've heard, the Republicans and the Democrats both say the people were on the boat after it got hit the first time. They were gathering the drugs. They had already made contact for other boats to come and rescue them, so they continue on their journey. And the admiral turned around and ordered a second strike, and which actually destroyed the boat and made it sink. They're killing hundreds of thousands of Americans.
So, Rodney, if I can pause you for just a moment, I do want to let the Major General respond to your question, but I also want to read a little bit here from a story in USA Today about that terrorist designation that you referenced. The foreign terrorist organization known as FTO designation declared on November 24th gives more tools to the War Department to give Trump options to deal with cartels, War Secretary Pete Hegseth said in an interview on November 21st. Headed by the illegitimate Nicolas Maduro, Cartel de los Soles has corrupted the institutions of government in Venezuela and is responsible for terrorist violence and drug trafficking, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on X. But experts said that the designation is not a military tool and that the organization it is leveled against, Cartel de los Soles, does not exist as an organized drug cartel. Venezuela barely contributes to the flow of drugs coming into the United States, accounting for just a fraction of the cocaine. It is not a source of fentanyl, the drug responsible for most overdose deaths, which is primarily produced in Mexico, according to the State Department. Rodney, given that information, I just want to give you those details if you wanted to finish up your question, and then we can let the Major General respond.
Well, I mean, I really don't have a question. My concern is that, our government is trying to protect the continental United States. And if you can stop any of the drugs coming in through the borders or through international waters, they're saving Americans. As far as Congress declaring war, I don't foresee that happening. Congress don't like declaring war on certain things, and if you listen to them, they all say, "Oh, well, these are innocent people, and they need to be, picked up and brought here, and let's waste the taxpayers' monies and, put them through the court system, and now we're going to turn around and let's jail them, and we're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars."
All right, Rodney, we're going to let the Major General respond to some of the points you've raised.
Thank you for your question, sir. And I will agree with you. Drugs are a scourge, and we need to do everything we can to prevent drugs from coming into this country, full stop. But we have been doing that. We have been treating it as a crime, which is what it is. And we have been treating the people who are involved in bringing drugs to our shores as criminals, which is what they are. The International Terrorist Organization designation, as was mentioned, does not give us the ability or right to designate the people who bring drugs to our shores as combatants. And under international law, we do not have the authority, we do not have the right to use lethal force against them without due process. And so I understand your concern about wanting to do all we can to prevent drugs from reaching our shores, but killing them indiscriminately and illegally is not the way to do it.
Bob is in Racine, Wisconsin, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Bob.
Hello, C-SPAN and General. I listen to you all the time. It's very nice. You know, if I was an airplane and they said, bomb these boats, and I didn't do it, common sense says, I don't want to kill this human being when we got Coast Guards to get them. And they say, well, you get a dishonorable discharge or you go to jail. Well, at least I'm alive, and then people in that boat is alive. You know, and I just like the Republicans say, and Trump, that fentanyl comes from. We got to stop fentanyl. Fentanyl doesn't come from there. Oh, I just heard the Republicans say that. I done heard it time and time again. Cocaine and reefer come from there. But they constantly. And then the last point, you know, it comes from Mexico and Canada. But they still say it. I don't know why the Republicans still say it, and I done heard it on the news several times. It's not fentanyl that comes from it. And even Trump said it. I mean, sir, I would like your version of what I just said.
All right.
Well, thank you for your comment, sir. What you described at the top of your comment is the incredible burden that's been placed on our military. Our military is now operating with several different lines of effort in an overall attempt to stop drugs from coming to our shores. Their particular line of effort involves dropping bombs or shooting missiles at boats and killing all the occupants. It's a tremendous burden to place on them, especially when the other lines of effort have been pretty successful in stopping drugs from coming to the United States. I think I saw a statistic yesterday that said that last year the Coast Guard seized over 500,000 pounds of cocaine headed for the United States. That's a lot. And right now, by far, the greater number of drug boats coming to this country are being interdicted by law enforcement. So my concern for our military is that we are putting them in a very, very difficult position of having to ask themselves the question whether the orders that they are being given are lawful or not. And whenever you have a situation like that, it just creates a tremendous burden on them. And it actually has the impact of weakening the military overall.
President Trump has threatened to recall Democratic Senator Mark Kelly, a Democrat of Arizona, to active duty in the military and then have him court-martialed. This is related to some statements as well as sort of an ad campaign about encouraging members of the military to not follow illegal orders. Can the president do that, court-martial Senator Kelly to bring him back into the military for this purpose?
Well, Senator Kelly is still subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Of the 6 members of Congress who did that video, he alone is a retired regular officer, which the UCMJ says it can apply jurisdiction to. So as a retired regular officer, he doesn't actually need to be recalled in order to be subject to the UCMJ's provisions. The president could simply refer this case to a court-martial and court-martial him. The same is true for all other retired regular officers. I'm a retired regular officer. I'm still subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, as are a number of my colleagues who are retired judge advocates. So the answer is yes, Senator Kelly is still subject to the UCMJ, but my belief is that he did not violate any of its provisions.
Bob is in Cookeville, Tennessee, on our line for Republicans. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, thank you.
I've got a couple of questions. if you're calling this a war crime, what would you call what the Biden administration did in Afghanistan after 13 Americans were killed there by a terrorist attack, and they blew up a house and killed 10 civilians and 7 children? And all the people that the Obama administration killed was drone attacks, including one American citizen. Where was his due process? And out of one other question, just exactly what day did you retire?
I retired in 2014 after 35 years of service. And I can't speak to the specific examples that you've given. All I can say, again, is that the laws of war establish different classes of people who are involved in an armed conflict. There are combatants who are lawful targets, and there are non-combatants who are not. And in the class of non-combatants, you have civilians, wounded and sick, and shipwrecked. And in the case of the boat strike that we've been talking about on September 2nd, that second strike arguably is a war crime because it targeted protected persons under international law, i.e. shipwrecked sailors.
Dan is in Georgetown, Massachusetts, on our line for Independence. Good morning, Dan.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on. I just want to, that guy, the last caller, brought up some points there about other adventures we've been in. But I've just got to say, after Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize, the campaign he had of dropping bombs on innocent civilians, hospitals, schools. He blew up a UN hospital, schools in Afghanistan, wedding party, funerals. Like, he was dropping bombs on innocent families in Afghanistan over and over and over again. So, just common sense here. You can take your law crap, and I won't tell you where to stuff it. But common sense says dropping bombs from unmanned drones with pilots from Texas on civilian families in a sovereign country, that's all okay because Obama walked on water. We all understand that. But now we have boats coming from, that they know exactly where they came from, what they have in there, right? We got pictures, we got satellite images. We're not arbitrarily shooting fishing boats out of the Caribbean Ocean. So the hypocrisy here is through the roof. And I'm telling you the frustration of the American people when you have a president who can do no wrong, that's a mass murdering thug, and then you have a president that's trying to do the best he can and get some peace going, and you label him the mass murdering thug. We're out here scratching our heads, sir.
All right.
I don't detect a question there, but thank you for your perspective.
Bob is in Amsterdam, Ohio, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning, General. What these Republicans don't understand, or I don't know if they're just not listening to anybody at all, but Trump, he went over to Iraq. He let all of the Taliban go and signed a treaty so that nobody else could do anything about it. The army that was over there wasn't allowed to even attend that meeting. He did that, and he got it in Kuwait. Now he gets a big plane from Kuwait. And on top of that, he said his Vietnam was...
Bob, did you have a question for the Major General related to these recent strikes in the Caribbean?
Yes. I want to know if Trump and Hegseth and the Admiral can't be tried in The Hague for murder, because that's where it should be going. And Trump should be impeached today, not wait. He should be gone from this country. Thank you.
Well, as to whether or not anyone can be prosecuted for these or any other acts that are considered war crimes or violations of our domestic U.S. law? The answer is yes. I mean, they can be prosecuted. The question, as you pointed out, is how and where. And, under these circumstances, it's not likely that an international tribunal would be convened either as an ad hoc tribunal or even in the tribunals that are standing. I doubt that a case could be brought or would be brought. As far as our own domestic law, however, there are consequences to acts like these, and it really doesn't matter what administration you're talking about. The rule of law means that justice is ultimately served, that the laws constrain our military operations, and when the laws are violated, there should be accountability. And the group of former and retired JAGs that I'm part of has called for accountability when and where necessary. So we're hopeful that Congress will indeed investigate these accusations, these events, and show the American people not only the video, but the Office of Legal Counsel memorandum that seeks to justify the boat strikes as legal in the first place, and all of the other things that have transpired and that we've talked about over the last several days with regard to the 2nd of September boat strikes as well as all others.
Gregory is in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, on our line for Republicans. Good morning, Gregory.
Good morning. So I'd just like to say to the retired general that you were a complete idiot.
Well, that's not kind. RW is in Marshall, Arizona, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, RW.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I just want to find out what's the point with blowing these boats out of the water when they can't even reach the United States. They can't even get here. So they got to go somewhere else to offload those, to redistribute them to come where they're going. I figure they're going to Europe. But anyway, if Trump's so wanting to get rid of all these drug boats and Hegseth, who's not qualified to be where he's at, how come he's pardoning Honduran president who was convicted of smuggling drugs to this country? What's the sense in that?
Well, as I mentioned, that is a concern I have for the military, because the military understands all of this, and to the extent that they identify hypocrisy within the policies that they're asked to execute, it makes it very, very difficult for them to do that.
All right, let's hear from Rick in Thousand Palms, California, on our line for Independence. Good morning, Rick.
Yes, I have two questions and one statement to make. First of all, if you're an invader of this country or doing something against this country and not a citizen, you do not have any rights, period. First question, why are you not indicting all the attorneys? Trump has 7 attorneys or more giving him advice. Why aren't you indicting these attorneys for giving false information? That's question one. And why are you participating in the attorney and JAG law license scam? None of these attorneys have law licenses in America. They are using a bar card, union dues bar card, as a fake law license. Why aren't you prosecuting the crooked attorneys in this country? That's question two. Thanks for your service.
All right.
Thank you. Well, first of all, with regard to the first question, we don't know what advice the president's lawyers have given him, because the Office of Legal Counsel, at least in this particular case we don't, because the Office of Legal Counsel opinion that we understand places these boat strikes on firm legal foundations has not been released. So the first step here needs to be that we all know what the Office of Legal Counsel said before we can draw any conclusions about whether it's a valid interpretation of the law. As to your second question, every judge advocate serving in the U.S. military has to be licensed by a state in the United States. In my particular case, I am licensed in North Carolina and Colorado, and I'm an active attorney in both of those jurisdictions. My colleagues, when they served in military, were required to be active attorneys in their respective states.
Before we let you go, Major General, it is Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this day.
Well, I mentioned at the top of the show that my connection with the U.S. military goes back to my mother having been liberated by the U.S. Army in Europe after World War II. And so, I joined the military. I went to the Air Force Academy at age 17 because I wanted to follow in my father's footsteps. My father served as an Air Force NCO for 28 years. And I wanted to follow in his footsteps because I saw the good that the military did around the world. I grew up all over the world. My dad dragged my brother and me from assignment to assignment, many of which were overseas. And I saw as a young child and as a young adult before I went to the academy, the great respect that our military was held up to by the people we met all around the world. They viewed the military just as I did, as an honorable institution that does good. And so I joined the military because I wanted to be one of the good guys. I wanted to defend this country. I wanted to learn how to do that. I wanted to be part of a force that could be deadly when necessary. But I also wanted to be part of a force that was honorable at all times. And so when I think back on World War II and I think about how the U.S. forces comported themselves during that conflict, we were the good guys. We were the good guys, and we need to continue to be the good guys. And following the law ensures that. And so what I would say to my fellow Americans is the law exists for a purpose. It ensures that the good guys remain the good guys. And that's what I hope we all want for our military.
Retired Major General Stephen Lepper, a U.S. Air Force and former Deputy Judge Advocate General, thank you so much for your time this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Later on our program, we're going to be taking more of your calls in open forum. But coming up, we'll hear from Axios Energy reporter Ben Gieman, who's going to discuss with us the growth of data centers and their impact on the economy, the power grid, and electricity costs. We'll be right back.
Tonight on C-SPAN's Q&A, former NASA flight director Eugene Kranz shares stories from his 34-year career, beginning with the Mercury program through the space shuttle era, including his work on landing men on the moon in 1969.
Neil Armstrong then flew the spacecraft searching for a landing point, and we were counting down seconds of fuel remaining. Normally, we landed with about 2 minutes of fuel, 120 seconds. But my controllers now started counting 60 seconds. And then pretty soon it was 45 seconds. Then it was 30 seconds. And about the time that we said 15 seconds, we recognized the crew had just landed.
Eugene Kranz with his book Tough and Competent, tonight at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN's Q&A. You can listen to Q&A and all of our podcasts on our free C-SPAN Now app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Boston-based writer Doug Most's new book is called Launching Liberty, subtitled To Build the Ships That Took America to War. Most, who spent 15 years at the Boston Globe, writes, and I quote, "In total, American shipyards produced 2,710 Liberty ships in essentially 4 years, peaking in the spring and summer of 1943, when almost 800 ships were built in 7 months. A lot of the credit is given to Henry Kaiser, who produced half of all Liberty ships, 1,490. By 1943, average time per ship was down to 42 days, the fastest month recorded. Author Doug Most is currently working at Boston University.
Author Doug Most with his book Launching Liberty, the epic race to build the ships that took America to war, on this episode of Book Notes Plus with our host Brian Lamb. Book Notes Plus is available wherever you get your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now app.
Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back, here to discuss the growth and energy demand